I used to think of myself as an average 20-something guy. I had an average life, average job, average wardrobe, average family. You get the idea. Then one day on my way to work, my average world was turned upside down. A drunk woman, on her way back from dropping off her kid at school, blew through a red light and ran right into the driver's side of my car. It was instant. Everything changed for me from that day on. After many surgeries and several years of rehabilitation, I'm in good enough shape that I can live on my own and function, as long as I have my trusty wheelchair. But it looks like walking just isn't in the cards for me. So much for the $6 million man. Anyway, I keep telling myself that things could always be worse. I really try not to wallow in self-pity, and I'm always searching for new skills to learn and things to keep myself busy. Since I have mobility issues and absolutely love computers, my brother and I would find new ways for me to stay mentally active online. The latest greatest thing for me at the time was Google Earth and Google Maps. Since it takes money to travel the world, I thought bringing the world to my little apartment would be the next best thing. I could visit any location in the world with one keystroke through my monitor. I became obsessed with the idea of virtually visiting a new place every day. One day I could visit Paris, and the next I could look out over the Pacific Ocean from the Santa Monica Pier. On a whim, I could visit the Great Pyramids of Giza, all from my tiny suburban New Jersey apartment. There was no limit to the things I could see. Not only were the places I visited fascinating, so were the people. It's interesting to look around at the people in the photos and imagine where they came from and where they're going. I would ask myself, what do you think this family's up to today? Maybe headed for a sightseeing tour of Windsor Castle? Maybe they're off for some deep-sea fishing after touring the Sydney Opera House. Now, you couldn't see anyone's face when browsing the site, but you could see the rest of their body, so I would have to use my imagination to fill in what they might have looked like. One morning, I decided I wanted to go scroll around St. Peter's Square. I spent a good half hour scrolling and looking at every building I could at every angle. At the end of my online tour, I decided to check out the people around the square. Near the obelisk at the square's center, someone really stood out from the crowd. I zoomed in for a closer look. It was a man dressed like he just stepped out of a time machine from the 1920s. He was dressed to the nines with a nice light-colored summer suit, wing-tipped shoes, and a straw boater's hat. I thought to myself, was there a costume event nearby? Maybe he worked for some historical place in the city? No matter, he seemed happy along with everyone around him. Sometimes I'll name the unknown characters on my trips for the fun of it while imagining their day. This guy I would name Gatsby. He reminded me of the story we had to read in high school English class called The Great Gatsby. That was enough for one day. I nuked myself some dinner and headed off to bed. I fell asleep thinking about all the places I would visit the next day and what interesting people I would see along the way. Bright and early the next morning, I started out in Vatican City where I left off the day before. The same angle was still visible, yet, strangely, Gatsby wasn't in the spot I last saw him. These were still images, so it's not like Google changes these pics daily or anything. Oh well, maybe they did today. Okay, it's time to pick my next destination. I think I'll check out the Great Wall of China, and imagine being a soldier during the Ming Dynasty, living in one of the various towers along the route, and patrolling my section of wall so that I can send warning in case of a Mongol invasion. As I scrolled along the wall, I came to the next guard tower and saw a tour group gathered around its entrance. As I zoomed in, I noticed something a little freaky in the archway of the tower. It was Gatsby. But how can that be? How can he be there when he was just at the Vatican before that? And in the same clothes? I was starting to get a strange feeling in my gut at this point, wondering if maybe I'm having a reaction to one or more of my many medications. I stopped for a Hot Pocket and some of my favorite root beer while I contemplated what I saw, or imagined. After lunch, I decided to try a little experiment. I went back to the Great Wall and looked at the exact spot I was in when I stopped earlier. Yup, Gatsby's still there. Okay, so maybe I'm not totally crazy. Now let's try a new location. I typed in the most unlikely place I could think of, Washburn, Maine. Once it was up on the screen, I went to Street View and started scrolling along some back road past old mobile homes that had additions clad in tar paper along the scenic Aroostook River. I spun around and headed back toward town where there was a plywood mill, a small general store, and a quaint-looking greasy spoon. As I'm scrolling along, there he was. It was Gatsby standing right in front of the greasy spoon in the exact outfit I had seen him wear in my other encounters. Was Google playing a joke? Is this like a creepy international Waldo book? There has to be some rational explanation. I quickly picked my next location, the Devil's Icebox in central Missouri, which is basically a natural tunnel straight down into the earth in the middle of a state park on a small trail. After circling the icebox for several minutes, I never caught even a glimpse of Gatsby, just a few overweight tourists in matching t-shirts like they were part of some stereotypical family reunion. As I was about to click back to the world map and pick a new location, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. As soon as I turned my focus there, just off trail, I saw that damned hat. I centered on the hat and zoomed in. Yup, it was him. He was standing in a different position than last time, but it was definitely him. Same hat, same shoes, same everything. Oh, my therapist is going to have a field day with this one. I decided to call my brother and see if he could see him too. After he answered his phone, I asked him to look up the exact spot I was looking at to tell me what he saw. He had a hard time finding the spot, so I sent him the coordinates directly. Once at the location, he could describe the place and most of the people right down to the corny matching t-shirts on the crowd around the cavern. But no matter which way he turned, he couldn't see Gatsby. He asked why I was making such a big deal out of him, looking at some weird tourist trap in central Missouri. I filled him in on my new creepy Google Earth friend, and he just about lost consciousness from laughing while taking a drink from his soda. He was laughing so hard that I couldn't make any sense out of him at all after that, so he wasn't going to be any help. After hanging up with my brother, I quickly chose another spot on the map. This time, I figured I would check a little closer to home. I searched the marina where my family would keep their boat through the winter, just outside Little Egg Harbor Township in South Jersey. As I scrolled around, I noticed that the boatyard was full, so these pics must have been taken in the wintertime, since most, if not all boats would be in the water the rest of the year. I scrolled to the dock where I remember cleaning fish as a kid after a day of fishing in the nearby bay. There at the fish cleaning table was my buddy Gatsby, still in his summer suit looking totally out of place for a half-abandoned boatyard in the middle of winter. I'm losing my mind, I thought to myself as I headed for another spot on the map trying to somehow desperately outrun this guy while going from one digital location to another. I tried to calm down by telling myself, yes, talking to myself, that this was all just a coincidence. There's no way this guy was actually in all those places I pulled up on the maps, especially in the same clothes and all kinds of weather. The next spot I chose was right across the river in Philly. There's an old sausage stand near the nightclub district on Delaware Avenue that used to serve the best hot Polish sausage sandwiches. As I came upon the sausage stand, I was relieved to see no one standing there. No tourists, no construction workers, cops, nothing. Then, off in the corner of the screen, I saw him again. He was standing in the doorway to one of the many clubs along Delaware Avenue. At this point, I feel like I'm losing my mind, and having a heart attack at the same time. My anxiety meds definitely weren't working anymore. Next up, my town. I entered the address of a store right up the street because, at this point, I'm paranoid and don't want to give my exact address. Crazy, I know, but I zoom in on the little bodega and see the usual looking crowd around the property. Some coming and going from the shop while others were on the corner waiting for the next bus to arrive. But no boater's hat, wingtips, or summer suit to be found. I breathe a little easier as I continue down the street. I check every nook and cranny, the schoolyard, the local municipal park, even a random construction dumpster that was on the street back when these pictures were taken. Nothing. Feeling a little better now, I moved down the street to the post office. I spun the screen to look at the front of the post office, and that's when I saw it. Gatsby headed into the local post office. My post office. It's less than 100 yards from my front door. Now I'm really freaked out. I quickly scanned from the post office to my apartment. I searched all around outside the apartment, the parking lot, the pool area, and even across the front of my building. Nothing. It wasn't anywhere around my actual location. Okay, it's time to stop cruising the world with Google, I said to myself. I just don't need this kind of stress and aggravation, especially with my existing health issues. At least I'm safe in my own home. As I sat there reassuring myself that everything was going to be okay, my doorbell rang. The bell scared me so badly that I could probably have run out the back door without my wheelchair. I tried to settle myself again as I rolled down the hall to my front door to see who was there. Luckily, I had a fisheye peephole installed lower on the door since I couldn't exactly stand up to see out front. I turned my chair sideways, took a deep breath, and peered through the peephole. I'm pretty sure I let out an audible yuck when I saw who was on the other side of that door. I couldn't believe Gatsby was here, outside my house. I pulled my head away from the door and tried to stay as quiet as possible while planning my next move. Should I call the cops? Would they even show up for something as crazy sounding as this? They would probably take me to the psych floor at the local hospital for a 72-hour hold. I decided that I would head back to the center of my apartment and pretend I wasn't home. Even if I had yelped a little when the doorbell rang, I could play it off like it was a neighbor or something. I turned and headed back down the hallway toward the living room and my computer. As I turned and rolled through the archway into the room, he was there. There stood the dapper, creepy guy I had seen in all those places around the world via my Google Earth adventures. He just smiled at me from across the room and said nothing. I turned to go back out the archway as quickly as I could, and there he was in the hallway. At this point, I must have blacked out. When I came to, I was half out of my chair and my brother was trying to help me get situated again. It was obviously evening since there was no daylight coming through the windows. "What happened to you?" he asked. "I've been trying to get a hold of you since you called me earlier today." He kept asking me what happened and asking if I was okay. I looked around to see if I could still see my creepy travel companion, but he was nowhere in sight. I tried to tell my brother the whole story, but he would never believe it. Would you? To this day, I've never seen Gatsby again, but I also don't go to Google Maps or satellite images anymore. I watched my mother and father pull out of the driveway and down the lane through our large living room window, waving shamelessly and smiling to them as they left. I turned with a sigh and the fake smile quickly leaving my face. It was about time I got this house to myself. I've been living in it for 16 years and they haven't even trusted me to stay by myself for more than a few hours at a time. Living in a suburb in Nova Scotia, just about the friendliest place in an already well-known friendly country, and they can't trust a straight arrow like me with the house for a day. That is, until now. A legitimate smile now christening my cheeks. Finally, I had a full day and night to myself. Just me, my Xbox, and a ton of junk food. I figured I would surely have diabetes by the time my freedom ended. I knew exactly what my time of freedom was going to look like. First task, take the Xbox from my room and hook it to the great big screen in the living room. Then get my savory snacks and drinks lined up so that I wouldn't have to leave the couch except for the occasional bathroom break. This was going to be epic. As I headed to the kitchen to grab my snacks, I spotted the large bowl of fruit on the counter that my mother always insisted on keeping full. I guess she thought it gave the family a healthier vibe or something. I scoffed at the idea of needing a bowl of anything other than chips and emptied the entire thing into the garbage. A simple but meaningful symbolic victory for my teen independence. I settled in, starting my day off with some Halo, and letting my iTunes library blare into my ears at a level that certainly wasn't called for with the already loud TV. I was living the dream. No parents telling me what to do and when to do it. No chores or homework. Just a boy in his digital wonderland. After a few hours of playing, something caught my eye. In the reflection of the TV, I could have sworn I saw something move in my kitchen. It was just a blur, but definitely not normal. I focused in on the spot on the TV for a second, of course trying to see if I could see it again. As I was concentrating on watching for the blur, something shot past me quicker than I could see what it was. "Bloody hell," I mumbled under my breath. I sat straight up and tried to figure out what just happened. I couldn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. Maybe my imagination was getting the better of me. Before too long, I felt myself getting a little bug-eyed from staring at the screen for hours on end. I glanced at my phone and noticed that it was just past midnight. I figured I'd call it an early night so that I could get started nice and early tomorrow morning doing whatever I wanted for the remainder of my freedom. I stumbled down the hallway toward my room, stripping down to my boxers as I walked, and then tossing my clothes into the hamper as I passed it. I hopped into bed intent on getting some rest so I could get as much me time in tomorrow as possible before life returned to normal. Not too long after lights out, I heard a quiet wheezing coming from behind my closed bedroom door. My eyes darted open as I listened to see if I could hear the noise again, or if it was just my overactive imagination. Maybe I'd left the TV on and that's where the mystery noise was coming from. After a few minutes of hearing nothing other than my own heartbeat, I started to drift off to sleep again. All of a sudden, the wheezing noise was back. It was getting louder and sounded as if it was getting closer. I clutched the covers tightly under my chin as I listened to the noises approaching my door. Then, just as suddenly as the noise started, it stopped, right outside my door. Now, I've heard plenty of bumps in the night in my life, and even with my overactive imagination, I've never heard noises like this, or been so afraid. My heart was just about pounding out of my chest as I stared at my doorknob, praying that whatever was making that sound wasn't brave enough to come into my room. After a few agonizingly slow minutes, the noise slowly started back up, and it sounded like it was headed back down the hallway toward the kitchen. Funny, as I listened, it also sounded like someone shuffling their feet, like they were tired or injured. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I don't think anyone could after hearing what I did. There were a couple rare moments when I felt myself starting to drift back to sleep, only to have my eyes snap back open again, trained on that doorknob. This was the pattern until sunrise. I never heard another noise after whatever it was reached the kitchen. Strange how seeing daylight coming in through the window perked me up some. Suddenly things became a little less tense, and I was able to start moving around a little. I sighed a deep, deep sigh and grabbed my cell phone. 2% battery. Fantastic. The first number I dialed was my dad's. It was barely 6 a.m. and my dad didn't sound too thrilled that I woke him up while he was away. "Dad," I whispered in hushed hysterics. "Huh?" He responded slowly, obviously still very much asleep. "Dad, there's someone in this house. I mean it," I said sternly behind clenched teeth. "You were up all night reading those stories again, weren't you? What time is it? Christ, get some sleep." Suddenly I heard a loud bang come from the kitchen, and every hair on the back of my neck snapped to attention. "Right there, did you hear that?" Hoping somehow my phone had picked up the crash. He let out a heavy sigh, and then he mumbled, "Get some rest and stop reading those stupid stories before bed." Then he hung up. I looked at my phone screen again, and the phone powered down. Again, perfect. A wave of despair washed over me. I could call him back, but all I would get is a speech about how it wasn't right to leave me home alone if I was going to get so scared and disrupt his trip. Now I started to wish they hadn't left at all. It was only 6 in the morning and they weren't due back until 8 p.m. I was pretty screwed in one of two ways, really. One, whoever was tearing up my house would come in and do whatever random murderers do. Or two, I was stuck in this room staring at my door for 14 more hours. I was really regretting not calling the cops with that 2% I had left. I didn't move off my bed for what seemed like forever. When I looked at the clock again, it was about 3 in the afternoon. I was tired of staying curled up on the corner of my bed. I finally gained the courage to creep off the bed and into the hall, reasoning that whoever was in the house must have left by now, seeing as I hadn't heard anything else in hours. I felt like I was walking on broken glass as I crept slowly down the hallway toward the kitchen. The only thing that kept racing through my mind was that one false move or a squeak of a loose floorboard could possibly send whatever this thing was into a murderous frenzy. As I made my way closer to the kitchen, I noticed the fruit bowl sitting upside down in the middle of the hallway. That must have been what the loud bang was this morning. I kept moving ever so slowly. Suddenly, a saw one of the landline phones sitting on its charging base at the far end of the living room. This was my key to salvation. I decided to make a run for it. I don't know what made me stop, but I noticed something out of the corner of my eye in the kitchen, and it made me freeze in my tracks. People say life isn't just black and white, just different shades of gray. And sure, they're right in some respects. I mean, every bad thing has to have some redeeming quality, I guess. Not all Rottweilers are ticking time bombs, right? Gray areas. But then there are some things that are black and white. This was not a gray moment. This was black, utterly terrifying in every sense of the word. No gray areas about it. This thing, for lack of a better term, looked directly at me, staring me down with a weird grimace and wheezing like I heard last night. It had all the basic characteristics of a human, but the proportions were all wrong. In my shocked stupor, I got a good look at it. It was only at my best guess about 4 feet tall, but it was much wider than he should have been. Probably about half as wide as it was tall, not to mention its head. It was massive compared to its otherwise frail-looking body, easily reaching its shoulders widthwise and coming down to its mid-torso lengthwise. The limbs looked weak though. Its arms were much too short and skinny to have any power behind them, and its legs were far too short and spindly as well. Its pure black eyes were way too small for its huge face, and were dragged down by the heavy bags under them. This thing was completely hairless, except for a few thin wisps on the top of its head. Skin tone wasn't too far off from a normal human, but it seemed like there was an excess of skin. It draped over the weird frame of this ugly beast like an old flesh-toned robe from the thrift store that you'd have to grow into. But its most striking and terrifying attribute was its massive jaws and teeth. The jaw was proportional to the head, surprisingly, which made it huge. But the teeth didn't make any sense. In its huge gaping smile, I could only see about 12 teeth in total. There were huge gaps in between them, and each one, both top and bottom, were in my guess about twice as long as my middle finger. They looked as frail as its arms and legs, but I wasn't interested in finding out. It kept wheezing loudly as it stared at me, tracking my motionless body with its tiny eyes. It looked tired, lethargic even, but very alert. I choked down some saliva before I noticed it shift its weight forward a little. That was all I needed to snap out of my shock and send me sprinting back down the hallway toward my bedroom. It stayed right behind me all the way to my room. I remember hearing the wheezing and uneven thumping of its gait as it tried to keep up. I remember that this thing was much faster than it seemed like it was capable from the looks of it. I slammed my door behind me and threw myself against it in an effort to keep the ugly little beast on the other side. There were several times that the monster pushed against the door and almost got in. I finally managed to get the door latched and lean into it as hard as I could. It finally stopped trying to push the door open, but it didn't retreat either. As I held myself against the door, I heard the same wheezing I did the night before, but this time much more angry and aggressive. It was as if whatever it was had its huge forehead pressed up against the door and was just waiting. I swore under my breath a few times. I was pretty screwed, trapped in my room with Mr. effing Longjaw out there. It was going to be a few more hours until my parents got home. I hoped that they would be able to do something about it and save me. I like to think of myself as a tough guy, but this was the most menacing thing I had ever seen. What if my parents couldn't help? What if this thing caught them by surprise and mauled them to death? What then? Even though I knew my parents could be walking into a death trap, I didn't move. I was just too frozen with fear. I'm no hero. I knew there was no way I could do anything to kill this thing or chase it from the house. I just stood there, my weight slouched against the door, in a wide-eyed, genuine terror as it wheezed at me through the door like a dog sniffing around for its favorite tennis ball. And so began another long stretch of time where I remained still, locked in a stalemate with my new housemate. I glanced over at my digital clock every now and then, only to notice just how slow time was creeping along. Just before 7 p.m., I heard the glorious sound of my parents' station wagon pulling into the gravel driveway. And with that, the wheezing stopped. Suddenly, I heard its booming steps run away from my door and back towards the kitchen before they abruptly stopped. My only thought was, oh God, it's waiting for them. As I heard the screen door open, a wave of adrenaline washed over me. I violently ripped my door open and raced down the hallway to try and at least warn my parents of the monster that was waiting to devour them. As I approached the front door, I noticed that my parents were already in the entryway. They were calmly setting their things on the hall table, and my dad headed back out to the car for another armload. I was out of breath and stammering unintelligible half-sentences to my mom. She placed a hand on my shoulder and told me to stop and take a breath. As I calmed a little, I scanned the area looking for the monster, but he was gone. There was no sign of it or the nightmarish wheezing. My mother gave me a familiar warm smile, like she was telling me that everything was going to be alright. Then she noticed the fruit bowl on the floor behind me and said, "What in the world? What happened here?" My heart jumped to my throat as I tried to find the words to tell her what had happened. She calmly walked around me and picked up the fruit bowl from the floor. Without a word, she went to the fridge and began to fill it back up. As she placed the fruit bowl back in its spot, she glanced at me for just a moment with this coy little smirk and said, "So, did anything exciting happen while we were gone?" Then she gave me a wink and went back to gathering her things to unpack. I'm not sure what happened, and my mom would never speak of that weekend ever again, no matter how much I begged. But my parents never left me alone again after that. And the monster never appeared again either.